Hello. We're back. So in the first half of the lecture I spoke about how sustainable development and the green economy were dominant parts of how we conduct environmental policy and how we understand environmental policy. However, sustainable development as a whole is not a fixed or solid or well-defined concept. Instead, in seeking to address environmental, social and economic issues, it has resulted in the presence of numerous different issues, priorities and values all within the same sphere. In other words, so many issues come under the banner of sustainable development that it has been emptied of all of its meaning. It has become malleable and ambiguous. And we see that in how it's discussed in, for example, greenwash, but also how we see certain energy projects being cast as clean and green regardless of their environmental impacts. And when I think of that, I think of the current discussions in the UK with the Republican Party calling for a return of coal as an energy source by calling it clean coal. The cleanness of this coal is based on how it is extracted from the ground, not in how it's burnt. So there is this misdirection at play. This use of sustainability values as a way to kind of legitimise something which is not is not sustainable. And as a result, we need to really question what alternatives there are out there. Because in many ways, as we move forward year upon year with no real policies which address GHG emissions and climate change in the way that they need to, we are seeing what is in essence the failures of the current system. When we look at Paris and Kyoto and the limitations of that, of this international environmental governance, we understand the important role of different interests, but also how this continued tension between economic competitiveness and environmental protection continues and raises numerous questions related to the system of the world that we live in. Don't worry, I'm not standing here preaching revolution. I am saying that we are seeing more and more social movements calling for system change, not climate change. In particular, there is a social movement in the UK which has spread into the US in recent weeks called Extinction Rebellion, which calls for a complete transformation of the way that we govern as a means to address climate change. Similarly, we see other key terms in environmental policy such as risk, so the risk that we have against environmental hazards, and resilience, so our vulnerability as well and our resilience to these hazards, being conceptualised in very broad terms which don't necessarily take into account different viewpoints and different understandings of how vulnerability, resilience or risk are understood. And in this last lecture I have with you today, I want to discuss a series of alternatives. These are alternatives to the current system of sustainable development. And we've seen them emerge in the past maybe 20 years, and they're, rather than sustaining, they're about transforming. You know, I don't want sustainable development. I don't want to sustain the current system which has created the problem we live in. I want to transform it for the better. It's not just about sustaining. When we talk about sustaining, we look backwards and we look to the present. When we talk about transforming, we look to the future. And I'm going to profile a number of different alternative sustainabilities which are taking hold in a number of different communities around the globe. These are not a novelty of the 21st century, sorry. They are rather part of a long search for alternative ways of living, but also a long history of such alternative ways of living, such as indigenous cultures. These searches are often forged in a search for social justice, or emancipation, or rights. But what is remarkably what's remarkable about these alternative proposals is that despite the fact they arise from traditionally marginalised groups, their critique is not limited to this social justice angle. They're also aimed at denouncing the dominance of economic growth. Okay, so they stem from localised movements, but they have much wider connotations in how they approach issues. Their critique of social injustice is grounded in a critique of social pathologies, or the dominance of how we manage our environment and our society. The quest for unlimited growth is equated with progress that is key, and that is a key avenue of criticism for these movements. These transformation discourses contest Western materialism, anthropocentrism, the destruction of the commons, and a blind faith in technology is something which will guide us through. All of these on the board here have emerged in some form or gained significance in some form over the past 20-25 years. Now, many of these will be familiar to you: environmental justice, climate justice, the Green New Deal, eco-socialism, ecofeminism, all highly important approaches to environmental issues. However, there are others here, such as degrowth and post-extractivism, which are emerging. Utopian projects are often seen as localised experiments, eco-villages and stuff like this, when there's collective organisation, but a distinct quality of all of these is that they are much wider. Although they are localised in how they may be applied, they have wider connotations in how we as people and as stakeholders approach environmental issues, as well as social issues as well. They call for a form of post-development, moving beyond an understanding of economic development as purely rooted in growth. They call for the defence of non-human species. So we're getting to that point now. But the rights of nature. And this isn't something which is kind of like a niche, kind of like hippie topic anymore. In recent years, New Zealand has granted rights to rivers in that country. Because to pollute that river is not just to affect the people downstream, it's to affect the river itself as well. And this is a bit odd, but in providing that river with rights, it is enrolling it to within a legal system which is there to protect people and businesses as well. It's giving it equal footing under the law. It's a key route forward to how we can protect certain ecosystems. In a context of current environmental governance, these transformation discourses seek to repoliticise the debate on the much needed change. It affirms that the fact that we have had, God, how many years since Kyoto? 20 years since Kyoto? 27 years since Rio? That it's time to change things. It's time to conceptualise everything in a different way. It goes directly against sustainable development and green growth, which I discussed in the past hour. It argues that we've let the status quo have its time and it has not fulfilled what it was supposed to do. It contests the dominant underpinnings of how we understand environmental issues and how we conceptualise policy around it. It is also, these alternative discourses have also asserted that sustainable development has run out of credibility. 1987 was when sustainable development was first conceptualised in concrete terms. I'm not even going to hazard a guess of how many people in this room were alive then, but I know that I probably won't be surprised it's a very small number. But it argues that over 30 years on, the dominant underpinnings of sustainable development and the green economy are no longer valid. And I was answering a question in the break about Paris, the Paris Agreement, and what I thought about the Paris Agreement, whether I thought it was a success. And the argument is that it repeated the same mistakes as Kyoto. The same levels of intrigue and negotiations and debates, which shouldn't have a part to play when we take on the global problem. We can define policies of the green economy and sustainable development as entailing a series of changes in the technology that we use, the way we behave, and the way we manage our resources. They call for the creation of new supply chains and new business practices based on more efficient technology and practice. They call for us to drive less, fly less, eat less meat. And they call for the way that we manage resources to not just think about what we take, but also what we leave behind. They bring sustainability and inclusion into how we produce, how we consume, and how we trade. They are not bad concepts. However, their weakness comes from how there's a trade-off between all of these things and economic growth. And these alternatives critique mainstream sustainable development policies in a number of different ways. They argue that there is a complete absence of any analysis of the historical and structural roots of poverty, of hunger, of unsustainability, and of inequality. These include capitalist monopolies, colonialism, globalization, racism and patriarchy. They are undemocratic. They are untransparent. And there is need for a more kind of direct say from stakeholders. That there is a total inability to recognise how economic growth has limits. There are biophysical limits to what we can do. That there is a continued subservience to private capital. And that modern science and technology are held as a panacea, as a fix-all solution. Yeah, there is some grudging concessions in sustainable development to other viewpoints and other voices. However, we consistently look to technology as a way out of this. Have you done geoengineering? Do you know what geoengineering is? No? Geoengineering is the belief that, I'm going to keep this neutral now and then I'll give my bit, but geoengineering is the belief that we can solve climate change issues, such as global warming, by using emergent technologies. So this could include sending kind of reflective panels into our atmosphere to reflect sunlight back out. So kind of almost circumventing the issue that we have with the sunlight being unable to escape. What else can it include? But it's based around using technology to solve these issues. So,
I think Harvard just published a study recently about some aerosol sprays in the atmosphere.
Yeah.
Could that potentially be harmful, though?
Yeah. So this is where I'm getting to. Yeah, is the fact that it could be incredibly harmful. Thank you for another. Does everyone hear that other example of aerosol sprays performing a similar function? I don't want to give too many examples because it's not my field directly. I don't want to give you some kind of crazy example of something which isn't actually really happening. But there are many problems with geoengineering in the fact that we don't know how harmful it could be, as we've said, but also the fact that if it does go wrong, what other issues will we be facing? I once worked at an event with a earth scientist, a geoengineer, who was planning a scheme based around this kind of injection of new materials into the atmosphere as a way to reflect sunlight. Hasn't taken off, not happening, do not worry. And they were asking about how many stakeholders there were, how many people could be affected if it went wrong. In their view, it was only the people from the local community near where their experiment was based. However, it's not just the local community who would be affected if an experiment of geoengineering goes wrong, it's everyone. So there needs to be complete regulation and monitoring of these activities. Yeah, I hope that explains it. Look it up. It's fascinating in many ways. It is the forefront and cutting edge of science, and it is well worth your time. The only reason I'm bringing it up is that we need to ensure that any efforts along those lines do not repeat the same mistakes of the past by having externalities which we were unaware of when we first designed the technology. Yep.
Could you also explain once again undemocratic point, please? The second one.
Undemocratic.
Yeah.
It's the argument that policy at the international level is made by a select group of people operating in usually a capital city once a year. The environmental policy at the national level is made by bureaucrats, often in a state capital, with very limited accountability. And the argument that it's undemocratic is predominantly based on the belief that the fact this decision making is closed off allows for certain interests to be heard when others are not. So the argument is that if Shell or Chevron or other entities, commercial entities, are present at Paris in 2015 and are able to meet with political leaders and negotiators, but certain civil society groups are not, then whose voices dominate those proceedings? So it's seen as undemocratic, but I would maybe change that term to be that it's not democratic enough. So there needs to be more direct participation, would be a better way to phrase it.
But this is probably one in the minority of ways of critique that are not embedded in the concept, because the concept does not include historical inequalities, but it does include the fundamental principle of democracy. Undemocratic is the implementation.
Mm-hmm.
It's the reality is undemocratic.
Yeah.
As a fact.
Yeah. So it's a critique of the current policies based around these concepts rather than the concepts themselves, is worth saying. But the argument is that the policies which have stemmed from sustainable development and, as a result, the green economy, are the only way we can really understand what it looks like. Because the concept of sustainable development is a series of quotes taken from the Brundtland report in 1987. So we need to understand what these policies look like. When these concepts are implemented and used, are they the same? So the argument isn't necessarily being against Brundtland and our common future, it's against what we have now. Number 6, the underplaying of diversity. This isn't just based around, say, environmental justice, which is the belief that communities of colour and ethnic minorities often face disproportionate environmental problems. But it's also on the fact that we need to take different ethical viewpoints, different worldviews and different spiritual values into account. Number 7, in many ways linked to number 3, which is that we do very little to address consumerism. If we just stopped buying stuff, then a lot of these problems could be solved. However, it's highly difficult to generate policies which would be able to address this issue. Whilst there's a welcome focus on sustainable production and consumption, there is no explicit focus on how to curb and drastically cut down the present consumption levels of the rich in the global north. Because climate change is a global problem, but it's created by in essence, consumption in the global north. So without any kind of addressing of consumption, the majority of humankind will never even have the space needed to become more secure and genuinely prosperous, as the Brundtland report calls for. Number 8, global relations built on local approaches and self-reliance are often forgotten and overlooked. Instead, we focus on the global, again and again and again, global trade in particular. Number 9, and last but not least, I guess, it kind of joins them all up together, is it misses the need for us to actually change how we see things, how we run things, how we manage things. System change, not climate change, is what is on the banners of thousands of protesters in London at the moment. The interesting, while I've been here, there's been a huge protest in London when they've blocked off lots of bridges across the Thames. And I think yesterday over 100 protesters were arrested on one bridge, but they formed a blockade, not letting anything through. And every time police took a person from the blockade and arrested them, another person took their place, which I think is a lovely poetry of what the environmental movement should look like. Now, these do not necessarily all look environmental. Yep, sorry.
Can we get back a little bit to democracy? Well, it plays, of course, a pivotal role while dealing with environmental problems. Basically, it's all about giving voices to a wider audience while deciding, making decisions. However, sometimes when we ask people about what when they don't understand the wider picture of the problem and they don't understand the consequences. For example, when we ask somebody, a whole group of citizens, whether they want higher taxes or whether they want taxes at all, most of them will say no, because they simply do not understand how taxes work. And I think that the same could be applied to environmental regulation. And sometimes, yes, democracy is very important, but on the same side, it is overrated to some extent.
Yeah. No, I would agree in many ways. It's that what we see currently is a changing political climate when different voices are becoming heard, which threatens, as I said yesterday, environmental protection in a number of states. Now that is, openly I would admit, that is when I'm not a huge fan of direct democracy. However, that doesn't pose an issue necessarily against how we run things or how these movements call for more direct governance and accountability. With these is that it's not just about, say, voting and giving permission for a certain set of policies, it's having a direct say in how policies are implemented. So it's not just about, say, higher taxes. It would perhaps be having a say not on whether there will be a tax, but where the tax revenue should be spent. And I don't know how it is in other countries, but in the UK, we have the NHS, and people are freely admit in surveys and in interviews that they would gladly pay higher taxes to save the NHS. So there is an altruism there as well. There, the current debate is whether 50p tax, everyone pays 50p extra a month, will be enough to kind of fill some of the shortfall in their budget. I haven't seen any kind of research on what kind of a higher tax for the environment could be and what it would look like on a month-by-month basis. But let's not have a completely pessimistic view of human nature. But also let's think about, rather than directing them towards, rather than directing the populace and the voters, the electorate, towards voting on what policy they want, as they traditionally do, give them a policy and discuss with them. So, for example, in Brazil and in Switzerland, they have direct democratic assemblies when they will debate certain issues and they will come to a decision. But there's potential for these to be enrolled within how we manage the environment, particularly on a local basis, And that's where a lot of this, particularly degrowth, kind of aims for. So rather than kind of like, let's all give a manifesto, and then we know that everyone's going to vote for lower taxes, having a wider discussion about what these issues are, communicating that, and then making it clear that this policy will work. Making the policy more holistic, more open to everyone else's kind of worldviews. Yeah? You're not happy with it, that's fine. I spoke about environmental authoritarianism yesterday, so you can sign up to that.
Yep, but sometimes it's not about taxes, but much wider problem. For example, if you take minor workers and if you say to them and tell them that we're going to shut down all the mining industry because we want to fight climate change, they won't be happy about that. No matter what kind of solution you propose, because they are going to lose their job and they have to move to other cities. That is the process that we can see across the globe, in the United Kingdom, in the United States, in Katowice, in Poland, where the last summit was held. So it's not that optimistic that we can just discuss the problems in terms of just yes or no solution without any middle points.
Yeah, but sorry.
There is still some solutions which will satisfy them. For example, education and another movement to another sector.
Too many glimmers of hope.
Like with your argument, with your example of coal miners, like the concept of just transition has come from that sector, has come from those people, from those communities, particularly operating in Australia in the late 1980s, where mines are being closed. That concept of just transition has been used in the COPs. It was signed into the Silesia Declaration last year. So that came from talking. That came from being aware. And what that teaches us, and what this kind of discussion and this openness and this understanding teaches us, is that we can't just design an environmental policy and say the mines are being closed. We have to ensure there's a wider infrastructure around it. Not just to make it popular, but to make it feasible as well. And I would argue that we get that from more accountability and more direct democracy and debate. Okay, any other questions for me? No? Great. So I'm going to give you a quick couple of examples before I hand it over to you for some discussion. The first, and these are admittedly localised examples, but I want to give you a bit of a taste for what these look like within a city, within a community. The first is the case study of Degrowth Seville in Spain. Degrowth Seville is a community of activists established in 2009 as a grassroots organisation with the purpose of facilitating degrowth ideas in a neighbourhood. To give you an example of what degrowth looks like on the ground, to give you an example of what degrowth is the argument that we need to stop fetishising growth, stop focusing on economic growth, start focusing on how we fulfil our needs in different ways, moving beyond consumerism, moving to a more local-based economy. And in Seville, they implemented a local currency scheme, community services, and a large urban gardening project. So since then, Degrowth Seville has become fully integrated within the area. The number of participants continues to increase. The local currency scheme, as of 2 years ago, had over 800 users. So gradually the boundaries between the degrowth activists who started this and others in the area, being local members of the community, but also other political movements such as the feminist movement in Seville, have become overlapping. Now the reason I'm telling you this is it shows that although localised measures remain local, they can become embedded quite quickly. There are a proliferation of local currency schemes across the globe currently, which keeps money within the region. In Bristol, we have something called the Bristol Pound, which is fantastic. And I recommend if you ever come to Bristol, take some Bristol Pounds out of the bank. But local currency schemes are based around ensuring that the money we have and the money we earn stays within the local community. We use it to buy food from local shops run by the run by members of the community, who then in turn use it within the local area as well. So rather than taking money out of an ATM and going directly into a supermarket owned by an American corporation, my money flows through the hands of other people in my community. It stays there. Similarly, there is a reclaiming of public resources, and think of these as public goods. In Seville, it primarily concerned a library. But a library is not just a room full of books. It also provides numerous additional services, a space for gathering, for meeting, for teaching, for learning. It's reclaiming space by the community. An urban gardening project, no matter how big, will not feed everyone. But it also represents a reclaiming of food for members of that community as well. And this degrowth-informed style of urban governance in Seville is characterised by a lot of open access resources. The reassertion of public goods, a reassertion of the commons. Residents, retailers and visitors in the area endorse practices of sharing. They openly share information, goods such as wireless broadband connections, which I'm sure all of us can appreciate, having often been left out of Wi-Fi. They're self-organised, and this is where the democracy comes in and the participation comes in the fact that assemblies are frequently gathered, so big meeting groups are gathered and have become essential to decision-making in the region itself, in the area of Seville. But then just to give it an additional flavour, they are well aware of their role in fighting other forms of it, other issues. They have ensured that their shared spaces address gender inequalities, for example. They ensure that there is valid and ample support for all members of the community. But one thing I like is they're convivial. They are based around friendliness. Now that's nice, isn't it? Not just reclaiming a community for your own, but smiling again. But it's about integrating that friendliness and that openness into how a community runs itself. This is small fry. I know this is small fry. I know this is local. But it demonstrates a community reclaiming its resources, reclaiming how it operates, reclaiming a neighbourhood. To give you a slightly bigger but still local example, I want to talk about a park built in 2007 in Paris, in France. This park resulted from an environmentalist mobilisation led by residents of a low-income, predominantly immigrant district of the city that aimed to transform an urban wasteland, which was 4.2 hectares in total, into a park. They were successful. The park has been built. You can see it on the screen behind me. It cost $26 million. It's a huge amount. The social movement drew on environmental politics as a means to achieve its aims for green space. but it also provided a way for the community to express and contest a variety of long-standing social demands in this low-income, predominantly immigrant area of the city. The vision of a green space was predominantly linked to the need for clean air, the need to address air pollution in the city. But it also included other demands, and this is where it's important, in the fact that in reclaiming an urban green space, this community also sought to address demands for new childcare facilities, so specifically gathering spaces for parents and children outside overcrowded apartments, a space for groups to meet, housing rights, a space for cultural productions, a space where people can celebrate their cultures. Now, both of these cases demonstrate the integration for environmentalist demands for green space or for reclaiming space into a wider struggle based around class or gender, based around community, based around race and income. And this is where these movements sit. Because I've spoken a lot about how there is a continuous tension between economic and environmental. And these movements kind of pull on a similar tension. They just subvert its direction. The argument isn't that environmental protection will hinder economic goals, but will instead provide for them. And it shows what happens when there is more voices involved. When local communities are able to reclaim their environments and their resources. And it also goes full circle back to the commons and public goods. Local communities have power in what they do. And we see across the globe an emergence of more and more movements, in cities in particular, which call for not just sustainability, but sustainability on their terms too. And if you have any questions about that, I'm more than happy to go through them. Has anyone got any questions for me now?
I don't have a question, I have a comment.
Mm-hmm.
About the previous case study. I also heard about one practice which is they use Danish settlements. They tend to share the things that they don't use every day. For example, a drill.
Mm-hmm.
We don't need it even every week.
Yeah.
They buy only one.
Yeah.
For the whole community, I don't know, for the whole community, and this way they deal with over-consumerism and other sustainable development issues.
Yeah.
As one.
No, thank you. Yeah, it's sharing.
Yeah,
I mean,
sharing again.
and we're seeing kind of, particularly in Western Europe, this emergence of cooperatives again. Yeah, so communities not just kind of reclaiming space, but also reclaiming responsibility for certain things. So we see more community banks, we see more community urban farms, and it's this, and when you talk about kind of like accessibility, self-organisation, reproduction, and conviviality, is that is what a community can do. That is what a community knows. A community knows its area better than anyone else. So it's relocalising, it's not necessarily democratising, but repoliticising sustainable development. It's saying there is no one size fits all here. We need to apply and understand our own kind of needs and our own wants. Any other questions for me?
But what you're talking about is very close to local agendas.
Yep. Yeah, it's super close to local agendas. It's just the direction of travel is slightly different. So if municipal governments, for example, or local governments are applying policies, then they still need to engage with these communities. These communities are reclaiming it themselves. So they're circumventing the wider kind of like governing structures. But no, it all ties in really well.
But they are belonging to, I don't know, villages, or because it's really difficult to imagine the kind of a community here in Moscow because people they don't feel like being in a community.
Yeah.
Everyone is alone.
Yeah.
Which is big mega policy.
Yeah. No, and that's true, and this is why they're small fry, but they're just empirical examples of how these kind of alternatives can work. Like, I'm not saying that we're going to have like a capital city of a country have their own, 20 million person cooperative or anything like that. What I'm saying is you can have a number of in that city. And when you talk about how there's policies for us to change our behaviour, talk about nudging, about incentives, about changing supply and demand of environmental goods, for example, and infrastructure, and who better to define what is needed than the community themselves? And this is where all these alternatives come in to sustainable development. Is who are these negotiators to tell us what we need to do. So yesterday I spoke about environmental authoritarianism, today I'm talking about this. They are two sides of the same coin. Very big, difficult coin, but they are two sides of the same coin in the fact that they both argue that there needs to be some form of change to how we run things and how we manage our lives and how we interact with each other. Okay, we've got a bit of time left, about half an hour. Did anyone do any reading? Yeah? Okay, I'm going to give you about a quarter of an hour, 20 minutes again to either discuss what you read or very quickly read something. And then I'll be bringing it back and we'll be discussing a number of things. But what I'm particularly interested about is, I'll skip that, is what does sustainability mean to you and how does that interact with contemporary sustainable agendas? Do you agree when I say that sustainable development is not working? If not, why not? If so, how can it be improved? How can we make Moscow as a city, or as the towns where you're from, and the cities that you're from, more sustainable? What should we focus on? Energy use? Traffic? And car use? Bear in mind, all this is going to be leading into what we do this afternoon. So I'll leave it with you for about quarter of an hour, 20 minutes. Read some of the texts which we provided to you for this course. You've already read them, discussed them with people next to you. How do they interact with what you understand as sustainability and environmental policy? If you have any questions, just let me know. I will leave it to you now because my throat is incredibly dry. But any questions, just say. Thank you very much.